Okay, so the session's now being recorded. This is quite a long session. So what I'm going to do is we're going to see how far we get in our hour. I've sort of allocated an hour to this. What we don't finish, I will record as a second collab recording and I will upload it for you. So I don't want to rush through it for the sake of getting to the end of it. I will, wherever we stop, if we have to stop before the end of the learning unit, I will re-record a second collab for you and upload it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I've uploaded all the slides already. At the end of this learning unit, there are some extra slides which I'd also like you to look at. So they're not included in your learning outcomes, but they are fundamental to what we need to know about this section. So those are at the end of this session. Those are the last couple of slides that we have. So where you all are now, you should have finished your first and second learning unit, and you should have read through this learning unit on the biology of the behavior. I hope you are keeping up to date somehow. I've seen lots of ICE tasks coming in, and I think I've marked everything that's been submitted to me so far. So just remember, we don't have a deadline yet. Our deadline will be in the middle of May sometime, by the time we need to get our CAS marks sorted. So as soon as we have that date, I'll let you know. I've also, next week, Friday, the 22nd, which is lovely, but unfortunately it's out of my control, is we will have our national support session for the assignment. So there have been 1 or 2 assignments submitted already, but I would just reiterate, please don't submit any assignments until after we've had that national support session, so that I can guide you through any areas that you might be having challenges with, and we can chat about referencings and things like that. So that's where you should be. ICE tasks in for learning unit 1 and 2. Learning 3 is after this, and we're starting to prep for our assignment with our national support session next week, Friday. It's at 6 o'clock. I've put it on your calendar, but I haven't sent the link out yet. But please just make note that we have a date on Friday the 22nd with our support session. Okay, so is everybody good? And if you're all good, we'll start with this learning unit so we make the most of our time. Any comments, just put them in the message box. So this learning unit seems like a life science lesson. And in fact, if you did life science at school or earlier, some of the stuff might be familiar to you. But if you didn't do life science, please don't panic. It's all very straightforward. It's simple biology. The book is very well laid out. It's very comprehensive. We don't go too deep into it, but it's important that we understand how the biology in our body works, because everything that happens in psychology is about our behavior, our mental processes, and our mind. And obviously the biology of our body is very important in how that takes place. So that is what this learning unit is. It's called the biology of behavior. Oh, wait for my slide to load. Okay, right. So those are your learning outcomes. That's in your module guide, is what we need to know for this learning unit. And they're all summarized, and we'll move through those different themes as we proceed through the material, starting with communication in the nervous system. Then we look at how the nervous system is organized and its characteristics. We take a look inside the brain, at the different parts of the brain, and how those parts of the brain impact on behavior. So there you can start to see the links come in as to why it's important to understand how the biology works internally from the nervous system through to the brain, because of the influence it has on our behavior. So obviously in our body, we have our brain, which is very complex, and at any given time, there are millions and millions of signals traveling from our senses through our body, through neurons into the brain, and the brain is making decisions, the brain is reacting, motor neurons are enabling us to move our limbs and our muscles, and all of that is part of the human neuroscience perspective on biology and how it impacts with psychology. We look at things like drugs and how drugs change our mood. We have left and right hemispheres on our brain. A lot of this stuff underpins mental illnesses and how psychological processes relate to biological processes, and to what degree can life experiences affect the organic tissue of the brain. So everything that happens around us has got some biological basis to it. Okay, so the first thing we look at is we look at how does communication take place in our nervous system through all of these millions of neurons that make up our nervous system. How do they actually communicate? And one of our learning outcomes is to really look at the basic hardware of the nervous system, and then to elaborate how the signals are sent through our nervous system and the neurons into our brain. So behavior depends on rapid processing of information. There's milliseconds between receiving a sensory input and how our brain responds to it. And all of that information travels rapidly through a series of neurons in our body. So our nervous system is a whole complex communication network where signals inside the communication network are constantly being transmitted and received and integrated. And it fires away all the time. What we're doing now, watching this PowerPoint, listening to what's going on around us, how we're feeling, all of that is our neurons in our body firing away with information. So how does that information actually travel through the nervous system? So our nervous system is made up of two major categories of cells. The first set of cells are our neurons. That's where the electrical impulses are transmitted, and the glia cells, which surround all of our neurons. So those are the two types of cells that we look at, the neurons and the glias. All right, so on the left is a picture of a neuron. It starts on the left-hand side with what looks like a bit of a tree branch, right down to the other end. The right-hand side was your axon terminals. So that top picture at the top is what a neuron looks like from the outside. So neurons are cells that receive and integrate and transmit information. So in the human nervous system, there's a vast majority of these are interneurons, which communicate with other neurons. And we also have sensory neurons. Those are the neurons that bring incoming information from our senses, what we feel, what we taste, what we touch. It's all receiving those signals from outside of our nervous system. It transmits them, and then we have the motor neurons, which carry the messages from our nervous system to the muscles in our body. So if, for example, you put your hand on a hot plate of a stove and you feel it burn, your first reaction is to pull your hand away. So that is a sensory input that comes through our fingertips, through our sensory nervous system, through our sensory neurons, and then our motor neurons are the neurons which carry those messages back to pull our hand away. So we have sensory and motor neurons. Inside of our neuron, if you look at the top picture, on the left-hand side is the dendrite, that's the branch structure, and right in the middle of that, the little purple dot that you see, that's our cell body, that's called the soma, and that's where the little nucleus of the neuron sits. So you've got your length of your neuron, and in the top part is your dendrite with your little soma or cell body sitting there. So the branch structure on the left-hand side is called a dendritic tree. It's like a tree with its branches coming out, and each individual branch is a dendrite. So if you put your arm up and you hold your hands out, the length of your arm from your elbow to your wrist is your axon, but that top part where your fingers are all splayed out, those are the dendrites, and those are the little pieces that are specialized to receive the information. So your dendrites on the end there, like your fingers on the end of your arm, they receive the information. The information comes in through the dendrite, and then you've got that long body that looks like a little string of purple sausages all joined together. Okay, that's the axon. So that is what actually from those dendrites and your cell nucleus, your soma, the information travels down that axon. So some of your neurons are really long, like your neurons that go up your spinal cord. That would be like a really long neuron, and some neurons are shorter, but the length of your neuron sits in that length of that axon. And the axons are the specialized structures that transmit information down the neuron and responsible for propelling it across to its next neuron. So neurons are all, they don't join together. Okay, if you put your fingertips towards each other, they don't join. There's a gap between neurons, but we'll discuss that shortly. But the information travels down the axon into those axon terminals right at the other end, and from there it moves into the next neuron. So neurons communicate like that. And around the axon, around those purple sausage-like structures, is like a little fatty sheath. It's called a myelin sheath. And that insulates the axon, and it means that the impulses that travel down the axon, if it's all insulated in myelin, they travel faster. So the information comes in through the dendrite receptors, and then it travels down the axon, which can be bound in a myelin sheath, which speeds up the transmission of that information. And the thicker the myelin sheath, the faster the transmission. So when we work on neural rewiring, when we work on practicing and repetition of things, we build that myelin sheath. It gets thicker, and the thicker the myelin sheath is, the faster the information transmits down that axon. And right at the right-hand side, at the end of that axon, are what's called axon terminals, or they can be called terminal buttons. They have a number of different names. And from those little buttons, there's little sacs in there which contain neurotransmitters, which are little chemical messengers. They're the messengers that move from one neuron to the next neuron. They're called neurotransmitters. So once the signal reaches the end in the axon terminals, the little neurotransmitters are released, and they go across a little junction called a synapse, and that's where information moves from one neuron to another. So that's a sort of overview of what a neuron looks like and how the different composite pieces of the neuron all work together to transmit information very rapidly from one end to the other. And we will go into this in a little bit more detail, but this is just an overview. So I hope that that's clear and you understand it. It's a bit of learning about new terms, but you take things very simply, take it from looking at it from an overview perspective like this, and then we'll go in a little bit deeper into how some of those parts work. Slide loading. Come. Sorry guys, this is where the internet gets a bit slow. Can you all still hear me? All right, there we go. So we've spoken about the neurons and what those are and what they look like from the outside. And the other cell we spoke about is the glia. And the glia are just little cells that surround the neurons, and they have a number of little jobs that they do. And we don't go into this in too much detail, but just know that the glia are there. They surround all the neurons, and basically they support the neurons from staying in place. They provide nutrients. They move to where neurons have been damaged to clean up, and basically they form a barrier with blood vessels to form a blood-brain barrier, and they provide insulation. So the glial cells are not much spoken about, but they have a very important job in actually keeping all of these structures in place and functioning so that our neurons can work properly and that our body can have information that travels through it. So how does the neuron actually work? What is this information that gets transmitted? So all of the information travels through our body. It travels through neurons as electrical signals. That's actually what the neuron transmits. It transmits electrical signals. Our body is made up of thousands of these little signals firing away down our neurons all of the time. Incoming information and information going back to our muscles to tell us how to move, how to think, affecting how we behave. So it's all about electrical signals. So generally, your neuron sits at rest. It's got a resting potential. It sits there very nicely. It hangs around. It doesn't do anything until it gets an electrical signal. And that electrical signal that's received by the neuron is known as an action potential. So the thing that travels down the body of that axon terminal is known as action potential. And the signals travel down from the dendrite right the way to the other end, to the axon terminal. It's an electrical signal. So that's the first step. is the electrical signaling. And the second step is where the two neurons speak to each other. That's the second step. So it takes place between the two neurons. So how does it move from one neuron to the next? It arrives at the axon and it releases those little neurotransmitters at the end of it, and they float across the fluid, the synaptic fluid that separates neurons, and it's received by the next neuron, which then also creates its own action potential. So the signal comes down one neuron, releases neurotransmitters, which are taken up by the neighboring neuron, which releases its next series of action potentials, and the next neuron fires. So that's the chain of how things happen in our nervous system, where neurons communicate with each other. Slide loading, sorry. Okay, so how does that little action potential work? So now we're going to zoom in a little bit on what is that electrical current that travels down the axon. So within our axon, we've got fluids, and we basically have on the outside of the membrane of the axon, we have positively charged sodium particles. And inside the axon, on the other side of the membrane, a bit like a dam wall with a barrier between, are negatively charged potassium ions. So on the outside of the membrane, we've got sodium, positively charged, and on the inside, we've got negatively charged potassium ions. And there's usually more negatively charged on the inside than there are on the outside, okay? And that means that there's a state of polarization. So when a neuron's not busy conducting an impulse, it's just sitting there, it's said it's going to be at a resting state. The neuron is resting, it's waiting for something to happen. The positive sodium ions are sitting on the outside, the negative potassium ions on the inside. Everyone's just hanging there and we're resting. Okay. When it's in a resting state, it has got a resting potential. That's what it is. If you put in it like a battery and you test the electrical current, it means that it's got a resting potential. It's sitting, waiting for, almost like when you attach something to a battery to use it, that's where it starts to change. But when it's resting, it's got a little resting potential of about minus 70 millivolts. And so the negative potassium ions inside, the cell is polarized and it's got a resting potential of about minus 70 millivolts. It's just sitting there. You can see on the little graph, there's a little stable blue line, which shows our resting potential. So nothing's happening yet in the cell. Okay, so now this is where the change in electrical state happens. So when the neuron is stimulated, when that little stimulus comes through and the neuron is stimulated, there's little channels in the cell membrane. So we've got the cell membrane acting like a barrier. It's got the positive sodium on the outside and the negative potassium on the inside. Everything's sitting there being polarized. And so now this little stimulus comes along and little channels open in the membrane once that stimulus comes in. And what that does is it positive charged sodium ions rush inside that membrane. And so now on the inside, we're starting to get more positive ions than negative ions, which means that that minus 70 millivolts starts to creep up to minus 60, minus 55, and it's depolarizing. And I'm sorry if this sounds like a bit of a science class or a life science class, but it's simple at this stage, and it is just fundamental to understand these very simple processes. So what happens then is basically the charge becomes less negative. So it was at minus 70, the positive ions come in, therefore it's becoming less negative, and it starts to create what is an action potential. That's where that a little electrical current starts. Okay, it starts from that action potential, and it's the brief shift in the neuron's electrical charge that travels along the axon. And basically, an action potential can only occur once it reaches minus 55 millivolts. If it doesn't get there, it won't fire. It's an all or nothing response. If it doesn't quite get to minus 55, then the neuron is not going to fire. It needs enough of those little sodium ions to rush in and create reduce that negative charge, maybe even make it positive, to take it up to minus 55 to fire. And so after firing, the action potential, the channels in the membrane that let the positively charged sodium ions in close up. Okay, so it stops it, and then there's basically a rest time. It's a refractory period. So it almost like fires it. It's like pulling the trigger of a gun. If you pull the trigger in, you have to pull it far enough for it to fire, and as soon as it's fired, you release it, and it's almost like the chamber of the gun shuts up again. So that's actually what happens. Okay, the positive ions rush in, the neuron fires that action impulse, and once it's fired it shuts up and it moves into a downtime or refractory period. So that's how the action potential moves down that axon. And it's got the myelin sheath, and the myelin sheath surrounds it. And the thicker the myelin sheath is, the faster that action potential is. It's not about the action potential size, doesn't matter. It's not about the strength. It will be about the speed of transition. Everyone's very quiet. Hope you're all still there. Okay, so like we said, the all or none law. Either the neuron fires or it doesn't. You can't half pull the trigger. So it's got to build up to that action potential in order to fire. Like we said, the size of the action potential is not affected by the strength of the stimulus. So the stronger the stimulus, it doesn't mean a stronger action potential. If the neuron receives a stimulus of sufficient strength, it fires, but if it receives a weaker stimulus, it does not. All or none, we said that. And so different neurons transmit different impulses at different speeds, and the thicker myelinated axons transmit neural impulses quicker than thinner ones. So on the left-hand side there, again, is the graph which shows the increase in action potential where it reaches its firing threshold, and then it refracts back to having no action potential. There's the picture of your neuron there on the left-hand side. In between, if you look at the little sausage, our axon, the little axon being sausages, those little gaps in between the sausages are known as nodes of Ranvier. And when the action potential moves down that axon, it almost slows down as it comes to those exposed areas, the nodes of Ranvier. But the myelin sheath almost like insulates those, and that's where your neural signal travels faster. It's when those little gaps in the axon, the nodes of Ranvier, are insulated, then it makes the signal travel faster. It's not stronger, remember, it's just faster. Okay, so right at the end, we get to those axon terminals. So the signals travel down the axon, and it gets to the end of the axon, which is on the left-hand side there. Okay, it's your axon terminal. And we have to get the impulse from one neuron to another. Remember, the neurons don't touch, is that the axon terminal of one neuron where the signal ends up, it's sort of sitting not too far away from the dendrite of another neuron, and there's a little gap in between called the synaptic cleft or synaptic gap, and that's filled with a fluid. So the neural impulse is a signal that must be transmitted from a neuron to other cells, and the transmission takes place at special junctions called synapses. So that's where our two neurons sit against each other with a little gap of fluid in between. And so the two neurons are separated by the synaptic cleft, which is the microscopic gap between the terminal button of one neuron and the cell membrane of another. And signals have to cross this gap in order for neurons to communicate. The neuron that sends the signal, okay, is the presynaptic neuron. It happens before the synapse. And the neuron that receives the signal is called the postsynaptic neuron. So it comes down, and you see inside the little axon terminal, there's little sacs there, little synaptic vesicles. Those contain neurotransmitters. I think you might have heard of neurotransmitters, but we'll discuss these in a little bit more detail. And that is what is released when that action potential reaches that axon terminal. Is those little synaptic vessels are opened, and those neurotransmitters are released through the membranes, and they are what travels across the synaptic cleft. Hi, John, I'm glad you're listening intently. Thank you. Okay, so the synapse is a gap between the two neurons where the chemical transmission takes place. And the neurotransmitters, those little things that come out of those synaptic vessels, okay, they transmit information from one neuron to another neuron. So at the end of the axon terminal within the buttons, most of the chemicals are stored in small sacs called synaptic vessels. And we saw those in the picture, and you can see them there in the picture, those little synaptic vesicles. The neurotransmitters are released when a vesicle fuses with the membrane of the presynaptic cell. Like we said, once that action potential reaches the end to the axon terminal, that little vesicle fuses with the membrane and its contents spill out into that synaptic cleft. Okay, so all those little neurotransmitters pop out and they float across. And they go across and they diffuse across it, okay, to the membrane of the receiving cell. So we've got one that sends them and then one that receives them. When a neurotransmitter and a receptor molecule combine, okay, so when the neurotransmitter comes along and it combines onto a receiving molecule at the neighboring neuron, when a neurotransmitter and a receptor molecule combine, reactions in the cell membrane cause a postsynaptic potential or a voltage change, and you have excitatory postsynaptic potentials, which is a positive voltage shift, which means that there's an increase in likelihood that new neuron will fire an action potential, or an inhibitory PSP, which means there's a decrease in the likelihood that the postsynaptic neuron will fire an action potential. So there's two different kinds of action potentials: an excitatory one, which means that the next neuron will fire, or an inhibitory one that means it won't. And you'll understand how these work shortly. Okay, so there again is the picture of our axon terminal with our little vesicles in, and they are released as soon as that action potential arrives. The little vesicle fuses with the membrane of the neuron and it releases from the cell into that synaptic cleft. And so basically the little neurotransmitters then either move across the synaptic cleft and they join on to the dendrite of a neighboring neuron. It's like a little lock and key. There's certain little dendrites and cells that will receive them, and then they bind onto them and they become locked onto them, or they actually become inactivated and they drift away. Okay, so not all of them get accepted onto those receiver cells. Some of them don't. They sit in the presynaptic cleft and they actually drift away. Once they've done that, most neurotransmitters are reabsorbed into the presynaptic neuron through reuptake, and that's a process in which neurotransmitters are sponged up from the synaptic cleft by the presynaptic membrane. So it's a process of reuptake. Once they've done their job, they've bound to that lock and key mechanism, they're released and they move back into that synaptic cleft, and some of them get reabsorbed. Most of them get reabsorbed. It's called reuptake, and some of them drift away in that fluid of the synapse. Okay, so basically the neural networks, there are excitatory signals and inhibitory signals. If there's enough excitatory signals, then the electric current can build up, reaching a threshold to fire the next action potential. And so millions of neurons must fire in unison, and most neurons are interlinked in complex chain circuits, pathways, and networks which fire together sequentially. So it's millions and millions of things all happening at the same time. Neurons can make new connections with each other, and sometimes neural networks fade away. But during development, the neural network forms more synapses than needed, and often there's synaptic pruning. So it's about development and it's about growth. New connections can be formed, old connections can fade away. And in the beginning, during development, there's more neural networks than we need, and there's a process called synaptic pruning, which clears away what we don't need. So neurotransmitters basically are chemical messengers that impact on behavior. And we'll hear about some of the names of these, which you've probably heard of shortly. And so the neurotransmitters are those little things that communicate between the neurons, and they're fundamental for behavior, from physical behavior, movement, to our mental health. That's what those neurotransmitters do. They work to actually influence our behavior and what happens. And specific neurotransmitters work at specific synapses. So they don't all work on the same lock and key. They look for the one that they need, and then they bind onto it like a lock and key. So with our neurons, we've got sensory neurons, which go to the brain. So when we put our hand on the stove, that's our sensory neurons. The way to remember it is same, sensory or afferent neurons go to the brain. Our motor and efferent neurons go away from the brain to our motor coordination to take our hand away. So we sense it, it's our sensory neurons take information to the brain, the information is processed in the brain, and our motor neurons respond and move that hand away from the hot stove or the hot candle. So it's sensory neurons and motor neurons. Okay, so those little neurotransmitters that we spoke about, those little things that get released from those vesicles into our synapse are things like ACH, and you've got a couple of pages of these in your textbook, so I suggest you just read through them, but I won't go into too much detail here, but there's a paragraph in each. So for example, your ACH neurotransmitter has an impact on movement, it has an impact on memory, it has an impact on our autonomic nervous system. Adrenaline is also another type of neurotransmitter. It impacts on arousal, a bit like our fight or flight response. Norepinephrine is arousal and vigilance. What I've put there on the right-hand side with the red arrows is if there is a problem with these neurotransmitters, this is where you start to get psychological disorders occurring. So for example, with ACH, if there is a problem with your ACH neurotransmitters, it can result in Alzheimer's. So an impact on memory. Alzheimer's is about losing memory retention of things. The neurotransmitter that works in the memory process is ACH. Dopamine is responsible for making sure our body can move. It's for planning, it's for reward. So if we take drugs, for example, cocaine, and it produces an addiction and it stimulates activity in the area of dopamine. Serotonin is responsible for our mood, for our happiness. So we need a lot of serotonin in our body to be happy. And so if you're on an antidepressant, your antidepressant will increase the serotonin in your body to make sure that you're happy and you start to overcome those depressed moods. So this is what the neurotransmitters do. Each one has a different function, and they're vitally important in managing our mood, our thinking, our behavior. Okay, and that is what psychology is about. It's about mental processes and behavior in our mind, and those neurotransmitters play a very important role in a lot of those functions. Endorphins, for example, are neurotransmitters to do with pain. So when you put your hand on the stove and those neurons from your sensory system are transmitting, it's the endorphins that will be the neurotransmitters that transmit between the neurons. It's telling us about the feeling of pain, which will travel from our hand through our sensory neural system, up our spinal cord to our brain, where the relative brain processes take over. So neurotransmitters are the little chemicals, and you don't have to know all of them, but there's just some of the major categories there that are covered in your book that just pay a bit of attention to, so you understand how they work, if that is okay. Oh, come. Sorry, some of these images are quite big. So we've looked at how the nervous system works. We've looked at how the neurons communicate. We've looked at neurotransmitters. So now we look at how the neurons are organized, the characteristics of the nervous system and how it's organized. So the learning outcomes for this section is to provide an overview of the peripheral nervous system and its different subdivisions, and the central nervous system and its subdivisions. So now we're moving on. If you picture, this is like the brain and the spinal cord that we're going to talk about. That's your central nervous system, and your peripheral nervous system is all the sensory and motor neurons. So in this section, we examine the organization of the nervous system as a whole. The multitudes of neurons in the nervous system have to work together to keep information flowing effectively. So information has to flow. Any breakdown in the system will cause a breakdown in information flow, which can end up with a behavioral outcome or a problem with our mental processing. So all of those neurons have to fire effectively to work together. So what we do now is we see how the nervous system is organized to accomplish this. And to do this, we divide it into two main parts. So our nervous system, this is now the entirety, it's our nervous system. It's divided into two main parts, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. So there's two different nervous systems at play in our body. So what you'll see next is a little structural diagram of how the nervous system works. Okay, so there's our nervous system, and it's laid out for us. Your nervous system is a complex communication network in which signals are constantly, all the time, we're always receiving information from the environment. Signals are being received, integrated, and transmitted. Okay, so just like our heart pumps our blood through our body and our blood vessels transmit blood from our heart to our organs, the nervous system does the same. It's the same way. It processes information. So our nervous system is divided into two parts: our central nervous system, which is our brain and our spinal cord, and our peripheral nervous system. And our peripheral nervous system is divided into two parts: our somatic nervous system and our autonomic nervous system. So you can see there how the nervous system is broken down into the two different components, the CNS and the PNS, and each one of those has its own subdivisions, which we'll cover next. Okay, so we're going to start with the peripheral nervous system, the PNS. So nerves that exist in our body, if you look at the little body in the middle, all of those yellow things, they are nerves. Our nervous system is made up of bundles of neuron fibers. So all those little neurons we saw that we haven't had an overview of, all of those combine together into little neuron fibers. And they're responsible for the input and output functions of the body. So if we look at the picture that's there, what kind of things does our peripheral nervous system do? All of those bundles of nerves, all bound together as nerve fibers, what do they do? The peripheral nervous system, it connects the central nervous system to our organs, limbs, and skin. So the brain and our spinal cord, our brain is at the top, our spinal cord runs down the middle. The peripheral nervous system is what comes out of that connects our brain and our spinal cord to all of our organs and our limbs and our skin. Our peripheral nervous system carries sensory and motor information to and away from the central nervous system. So putting our hand on the hot plate, sensory information carried to our central nervous system. From the central nervous system, it's processed and transmitted back to our motor nervous system, which causes us to pull our hand away. So it allows the brain and the spinal cord to receive and send information to other parts of the body. And it also, our peripheral nervous system regulates all of those involuntary bodily functions like our heartbeat and our breathing. So our heart's not connected to our brain or our spinal cord, but it is connected through the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system has a very important job of actually keeping us alive and keeping our body functioning. The PNS. Okay, so we saw in our little structure at the beginning that our PNS, our parasympathetic nervous system, is actually made up of two divisions. It's made up of, on one side, the somatic nervous system, which we'll discuss first, and then we'll talk about the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system is about our senses. It allows us to feel the world around us. Okay, everything that's to do with our senses, input of sensory information, is coming to us through our somatic nervous system. And so we also called them afferent neurons. Remember, it's information being carried to the brain. Also called afferent neurons. Sensory neurons carry information from the nerves to the central nervous system. It's these sensory neurons that allow us to take in the sensory information and send it to the brain. So for example, in the picture we've got on the left-hand side, if you're thirsty, your sensory input is thirst. You need water, so it's your sensory system that takes that information to the brain, that recognizes that you're thirsty, and your motor output will actually, you'll pick up the glass and you'll have a drink of water. So the sensory information comes in through our sensory neurons, and then our body responds through the motor neurons, which we said are called efferent neurons. So remember, same, sensory is afferent, motor is efferent. Sensory goes to the brain and the central nervous system, motor is away from the brain. And that carries information from the brain and spinal cord to the muscle fibers throughout the body. And those motor neurons allow us to take physical action in response to the stimuli. So sensory input in, motor output is the outcome of that sensory information once it's been processed by our central nervous system. So that's the first part of our PNS, is our somatic nervous system. Somatic and sensory sound quite similar, so it's a good way to remember it. The other half of our peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so that's the bit that we said is responsible for keeping us alive, connecting organs. So the autonomic nervous system is composed of nerves that connect the heart, blood vessels, muscles, and glands, so all of the other things. It's a separate autonomous system, although ultimately governed by the central nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system also has two little divisions. So it's again subdivided into two different parts. We have the sympathetic nervous system and we have the parasympathetic nervous system. Those are the two little junctures of our autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is basically, its primary response is the fight or the flight response. So situations that require an expenditure of energy in our bodies, which we call fight or flight or arousal, to respond to something, that is what our sympathetic nervous system does. It creates that ability to have fight or flight when a situation occurs and we need to respond to it. That's what the sympathetic does. The parasympathetic nervous system is thanks, Jean, is the opposite of that. Okay, that is the part of us that allows us to rest and restore. It's called rest and digest. So that nervous system allows our body to be at rest. It allows us to uptake nutrients. It allows us to restore and store energy, return energy to our system. So the two almost act opposite each other. We're either in a state of rest and digest, but when the situations occur and our sympathetic nervous system kicks in, our body responds through fight or flight, and that's the sympathetic nervous system. So there we are. There's an example of how the parasympathetic nervous system works. It conserves our energy, and the sympathetic nervous system mobilizes our energy. It's that when you get that response when something comes in front of you, do you run away or do you stay and fight? Okay, the sympathetic mobilizes our body's resources to fight or flight. So pupils become dilated. You know, your mouth dries up when you've got a fear stimulus in front of you. Your bronchial passages dilate. You breathe deeper. Your heart starts to beat more. Your adrenaline is secreted. You start to sweat. The hair follicles, you get goosebumps. Your bladder might relax itself. So all of those things that happen in that point in time where you've got something that comes in your way that gives you that response that you need to fight it or just run. That's your sympathetic nervous system being mobilized. And when your sympathetic system is not being mobilized, your parasympathetic nervous system is at work. It's conserving. Okay, so you don't breathe as deeply, your heart rate is normal, your body is busy working on digestion to take in nutrients, to give you energy, your bladder is contracted, it's not relaxed. So we're either in a state of rest and digest response, or we're in a state of fight and flight response. So the moment something crosses your path and you get that feeling where you sort of adrenaline starts rushing through your body, you start to breathe deeper, your heart starts to beat, that's your sympathetic nervous system at work. I think, does everybody understand that? Okay, your central nervous system. So we had our peripheral nervous system, our central nervous system. The central nervous system is our brain and our spinal cord. Okay, that is our central nervous system. And it integrates information from inside and outside the body, and it basically coordinates our actions. That's what the brain does. Our spinal cord really is made up of nerve fibers, and it's like a channel, it's a conduit for information. Okay, so information travels up our spinal cord. Some of our responses can be spinal reflexes. There are things where for example, you go to the doctor and he taps you on the knee and your leg jerks. That automatic reflex where there's no brain involvement. The spinal cord does have some of those reflexes. But basically it does work as a conduit for information to the brain. It's obviously made up of sensory neurons going up to the brain and motor neurons coming down from the brain, as well as some interneurons in between. So the spinal cord is that channel for information. And both of those systems, our spinal cord and our brain, are very protected. They're protected by bone, they're protected by membranes, and they're protected by cerebrospinal fluid. So they are important pieces of our anatomy, and our body protects them well. Okay, so that's what we spoke about as a spinal reflex. So that's where there's no brain involvement. So if you sort of get stuck with a pin or put your foot on a tack or something, you have an automatic spinal reflex that makes you pull your foot away. So if you stand on a drawing pin, that pain is quick, it's sharp, and somehow your body actually reacts to pulling your foot away before your brain's even processed that that's actually happened and the amount of pain you feel. So there are messages that your spinal cord can send without transmitting to the brain. Like a spinal reflex. So standing on a pin, your first reaction is an involuntary, pull it away. It's an involuntary reaction. You move your foot away automatically, and then a little while later, your brain starts to process the information. You go, ouch, I stood on a pin, but you've already actually pulled your foot away from the pin. So that's just an example of a spinal reflex that occurs. So how do we know all of these things happen? And again, it's just another section of our textbook. It's a theme there about looking inside the brain. And obviously, as technology has changed and medicine has changed, we can see more and learn more about the brain. And what we learn and what we see just changes all the time by the different techniques we use to study the brain. So people who conduct research on the brain and parts of the neurosystem are called neuroscientists. Okay, and obviously neuroscientists have to collaborate with other disciplines because there's a lot of overlap between the biology, the physiology, psychology, and psychiatry. So all of those things come into a position where there's multidisciplines involved in looking at the brain and researching the brain. And there's specialized techniques that people use. The change in the past, it used to be based on electrical recordings. Often the way people could see how the brain worked was by finding out what happened if a part of the brain didn't work. When you had people many years ago who went into psychiatric hospitals and they performed things like frontal lobotomies, by then seeing how people behaved when pieces of the brain were removed or they weren't working, that's how they actually worked out what the function of that part of the brain is. But more recently, we've been able to get new techniques, things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, brain imaging techniques, and different assessment methods, so we can study the brain, its structure and its function in far more detail than we used to be able to. So what I'll do is I'll just leave you to read through those sections in your textbook. There's just talks about different ways that people can examine the brain, putting in electrical currents and seeing what's stimulated by putting in currents, putting dyes and things into the brain to see what part of the brain light up when you do something, which part of the brain reacts. There's different ways to look at how the brain works, and that's covered in your book, and it's just one of your learning outcomes. So the final piece of the puzzle is the actual brain. So we've had the information go up the spinal cord, and now it reaches the brain. And that's probably the most complex part of this process, is our brain and how the brain is structured and how the different parts of the brain have different impacts on our behavior and our cognitions. And so the brain is divided into three major regions. We have the hindbrain, which you can think of as the back. It's sort of just above your spinal cord. You have the midbrain, and you have the forebrain. So at the top of your spinal cord is your brain stem, and that's got little folds in it, and all the little folds in the brain, basically it's like the surface area of the brain is all compacted up. If you had to cut the brain open and lay it flat, you'd have an enormous surface area. But in order to condense everything into your brain, there's little folds which increase the surface area of the brain, which allows so many more neurons to actually work inside your brain. And at the brain's lower end, which is the brain stem, it looks like an extension of the spinal cord. And at its higher end, right at that forebrain, it's much bigger and it lies deep within the brain. So that's a picture of the brain, and you can see the hindbrain is at the back, the midbrain is in the middle, and the biggest part of our brain, the forebrain, sits at the front. I'm just looking at time here. Are you all okay for another 5 minutes or so? Okay, thanks, Lou. Thanks, everybody. Okay, so the hindbrain, that's that little back part of the brain. And, you know, guys, this is just about reading, and it's making your own mind maps of these different pieces of the brain. If we have a take-home exam, obviously you don't have to learn this stuff off by heart, but I think it's a case of being aware as to the different parts of the brain and how they impact on behavior. There's diagrams, and just understanding it. So we'll just go through it quite slowly, and you can just really see how those different parts of the brain impact on our behavior and our thoughts and our mental processes. So the back part of the brain, that hindbrain, includes the cerebellum. That's the name of one of the little structures that's found there, and it contains the medulla and the pons. So there's all small areas. It's called the reptilian brain, probably because it's the first part of our brain to form. Therefore, it's the oldest part of our brain, and it's the part of the brain that regulates for survival. So the cerebellum, what the cerebellum does, that little oyster shape there labeled the cerebellum, that is important for coordinating movement, the sense of equilibrium in our body, physical balance, our positioning of our limbs. So if we damage the cerebellum, we might upset our sense of balance, feel like our positioning in space. Damage to the cerebellum disrupts fine motor skills involved in writing, for example, or typing. So that's what that part of the brain does. Okay, it's important for movement, very important for movement, and any damage to that can cause damage to our movement. The pons, a small little area of the brain, has several clusters of cell bodies, and that plays a role in our sleep regulation and our arousal. So that's what the pons does. So you're starting to see that all of these little pieces of our brain work together to impact on behavior. And one of the things we look at around consciousness when we move on to the next chapter is around sleep and arousal cycles and that kind of thing. And that's where the pons comes in. It's regulating our sleep and arousal patterns. The medulla, which attaches to the spinal cord, okay, so the medulla controls largely unconscious but essential life functions. So the medulla sits there, it regulates our breathing, maintaining our muscle tone, and regulating circulation. So that's our hindbrain. It's made up of those three little structures. When you read different literature, sometimes they put these structures into different sort of areas, maybe in a hindbrain or a midbrain, but I'm following the textbook, and this is how they're all attributed in the textbook, is these three little areas are contributed into the hindbrain or our survival brain. And that's what it is. It keeps our body alive. It's our survival brain. The midbrain, so that sits just up above the hindbrain. Okay, it sits between the hindbrain and that big forebrain front part. And the midbrain is concerned with certain sensory processes, such as locating where things are in space. For example, coordinating vision and hearing. So that's what the midbrain does, and it's the origin of important systems of dopamine releasing axons. And among other things, this dopamine system is involved in the performance of voluntary movements. It also comprises the reticular formation, which is the modulation of our muscle reflexes, breathing, and pain perception. And again, the reticular formation has an important role to play in the regulation of sleep and arousal. So if we look at Parkinson's disease, where people start to lose control of some of their motor functions, they start to shake, basically that disease is due to a degeneration of neurons in this area. So those sensory processes, locating and coordinating where things are in space, coordinating vision and hearing. Basically, Parkinson's disease is the degenerations of neurons in that area. And activity in the ascending fibers of the reticular formation is essential to maintaining an alert brain. So those are the pieces of the midbrain that we need to pay attention to. And the forebrain is the most important part. It's the biggest and most complex region of the brain. And it encompasses a variety of structures, including the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the limbic system, and the cerebrum. So the forebrain's the big frontal part of our brain where most of our cognition and our thinking takes place. Processing information from our senses takes place in the thalamus. So it's the most important part and complex part of the brain. So the thalamus is a little piece in that area, and it's a structure in the forebrain which all sensory information except smell must pass through. So it's a little bit like a relay station. So when we see something and the information needs to go to our visual cortex, it doesn't just go straight to our visual cortex. It all goes through the relay station of the thalamus. When we hear something, that auditory sense of information goes through the thalamus, which is the relay station, and then it moves on to those different parts of the brain that determine our response to it. So the thalamus is the relay station, and information goes into that little thalamus, and from there it radiates out to the other parts of that front forebrain that need to process that information. The hypothalamus is also made up of distinct nuclei, and they basically regulate a variety of basic biological function, including fighting, fleeing, feeding, and mating. It controls the autonomic nervous system. So we've just spoken about the autonomic nervous system, and what controls it is controlled by the hypothalamus. It includes the theory of homeostasis, which keeps, or not a theory, but it's the physicality of homeostasis, which maintains a steady internal environment, and it secretes many hormones. So when it comes to the endocrine system and secreting hormones in our body, it's that hypothalamus that is the important part of our body that regulates all those hormones that run through us. So it's a vital link between the brain and the endocrine system, okay, and secretes hormones such as the pituitary gland. So that's what the hypothalamus does, thalamus and hypothalamus. The limbic system. Okay, the limbic system is our animal brain. Animal brain is just similar to other animals, and functions are necessary but primitive. It's a very instinctive system. So in our forebrain, we've got a loosely connected network of structures involved in emotion, motivation, memory, and self-preservation, basically things to do with eating, aggression, and reproduction. Okay, it's about that survival, instinctive, primitive system that keeps us alive. It plays an important role in self-preservation, learning, and memory processes. That's what the limbic system does. The amygdala is the emotional center that deals with fear and aggression. The hippocampus is important because that is where learning and memory takes place, especially where long-term memory, consolidating memory, memories into long-term memories, that happens in our hippocampus. So you can see how these parts of the brain impact on our psychology. Very important when it comes to learning and memory, very responsible when it comes to emotion. And a lot of dysfunctions in these areas are underlying reasons for some of the psychological disorders that we experience. We have our olfactory bulb, which processes about smell, information about odors, and we have the cingulate gyrus, which is involved in processing emotions and behavior regulation. It also helps regulate our autonomic motor function. So those are also areas in the brain that are important for us to know as part of our forebrain. And the cerebrum, that's the big part of the brain. It's the largest and the most complex part of that forebrain, okay? And it's the part of the brain that's responsible for our most complex mental activities, including learning, remembering, thinking, and consciousness. Those important things that impact on our mental processes and keeping us going. The cerebrum is divided into two halves. We've heard of this. We've heard of left brain and right brain. We've got a left half and a right half. They're called cerebral hemispheres, our left side and our right side. And each of those little hemispheres, our left side and our right side, is divided again into 4 different lobes. And if we break those two little halves apart, we see that inside there's a structure called the corpus callosum. So our cerebrum, the biggest part of our forebrain, the most complex part that helps us remember, learn, think, it regulates our consciousness, is divided into 2 halves, which again are divided into 4 different lobes. So it's divided by deep fissures into 4 lobes, and each of those lobes has a specific purpose. So the occipital lobe includes the cortical area. We're going to cover some of these lobes when we move on to our next section around sensing and perceiving, how we sense information and how we perceive it. So we will revisit this in the next learning unit. So basically the occipital lobe, that is where when we see something, those sensory signals from our eyes travel through our nervous system into our thalamus, which is the relay station, and from there it goes to our occipital lobe with the primary visual cortex, which helps us interpret what we're seeing. So sight goes to a specific area of the brain. The parietal lobe registers the area for touch. So the primary somatosensory cortex, information from touch comes in, it goes through the relay station of the thalamus, and it goes to this lobe, which tells us about what we're feeling. It helps us position our body. That's to do with our sense of touch. The temporal lobe, that's the other third of the lobe, okay, that is where our hearing goes. So when we hear something, it goes to the primary auditory cortex. So it goes through the thalamus, the relay station, and the relay station sends it off to the primary auditory cortex, where we can interpret what we are hearing. So that's to do with hearing. And the frontal lobe is the primary motor cortex, which controls movement of muscles. So more area is given for fine motor control, obviously because it takes more effort to use fine motor than your bigger physical motor issues or your gross motor skills. So more areas given to fine motor control. So people who damage that motor cortex have problems with mobility. They might lose control of being able to hold things, or might start to lose the use of their limbs, and it could be through damage to that primary motor cortex. The prefrontal cortex involves planning of behavior, attention, and judgment. And abnormalities in that area around behavior, attention, and judgment can account for characteristics and disorders such as schizophrenia and ADHD. So there you can see again underlying psychological disorders that can come from damage to the brain area, parts of the brain not functioning correctly, can account for characteristics in some of those disorders. Okay, and I'm just going to do this now as the last slide. Have these slides been uploaded? They're going to be uploaded on the station. I can't find. They should be there. I have uploaded them, Daniela, but I will check. I did it before the collab. My epilepsy is in my frontal cortex. Could there be a link between anxiety and seizures? I don't know. Michelle, I can't answer you that question, but probably the fear generated by the thought of having a seizure could actually increase your anxiety levels. So the two could be interconnected, but maybe not directly, maybe indirectly. So damage to the brain, as we said, we can see that damaging parts of the brain causes problems with different outputs. And I think who's it on the news at the moment who has just been, Bruce Willis. I think it's Bruce Willis has just been diagnosed with aphasia. There we go. So Bruce Willis, as you know, has been diagnosed with aphasia. And quite interestingly, it happened as I was preparing this particular learning unit and slide. So damage to the brain like aphasia can lead to problems with language production. So in this case, there's two areas of the brain that are involved with language production. One is called Broca's area, so that is the production of speech. So basically, if that area has got damaged, people are unable to speak properly. It might be incoherent, unable to form words, unable to put words together in a sentence, but basically damage to the Broca's area, it affects how people produce speech. Then you have Wernicke's area, and if you damage the Wernicke's area, which also aphasia, it's a damage to part of the brain leading to problems in language production, damage to that area of the brain basically means people have that think they're speaking normally to have difficulty in understanding others. So Bruce Willis, for example, has aphasia, but they haven't actually said which type of aphasia or which area of his brain is damaged, whether it's production of speech or comprehension of speech. It could be both, but that could be quite an interesting thing to follow, and understanding what you've learned in this area to sort of see how that problem could occur. So if you see a patient and they're unable to speak properly, then you know that it could not be necessarily be a psychological disorder. It could be due to damaging a part of the brain that is enabling language production. The last section of the brain, and again, I think you can just read it. Okay, let me check. Let me double check. You know what, guys? You know what I think I might have done? And apologies, I've put it on one group, but not the other group. Sorry, I'll fix it after this collab, so you should all have it. I can't remember. It probably went on to group 1 and not group 2. I'll fix it for you now. Carrie Ann, if you're on group 2, I think that's where the problem is. The final part of this is about the right brain and the left brain. Which side of the hemisphere is responsible for different functions. So they say now the left hemisphere is involved with language, speaking, reading, thinking, and reasoning, and the right hemisphere is involved in spatial relationships, patterns, drawings, music, and emotion. So you often hear people say that they have been tested and they're left-brained or right-brained, but basically that's quite a simple situation. Generally, people are not one side or the other. One side might be slightly more dominant than the other, and it's also different between different individuals. So you're not ever going to be completely left-brained or completely right-brained. You might be slightly more dominant in one side of the brain, but again, everybody is different. So that section is in your textbook and you can have a look at it. And I think, okay, so what I'm going to do, guys, is I'm going to end it here. The last couple of slides, and it's in your book. This is not listed as a learning outcome, but I still feel that it's fundamental for you guys to understand the endocrine system. It's really important to understand how the hormones work in your body and the different types of hormones that have an impact on your body. So that I have included a slide about that. I also feel the final part of your textbook sits around genetics, and it's not in your learning outcomes, but again, I feel it's not a long section, it's a couple of pages. Please, 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 will you look at it? It's important to understand the nature and nurture debate that takes place. A lot of what we do in our future chapters around psychology, especially around psychological disorders, will link back to these issues around genes and what is genetic and what is impacted by an environment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just record a separate short little collab to go through these slides, because I still feel that it's very fundamental for you guys to know this. It's not in your learning outcomes, but really I think we do need to cover it. So I'll cover that separately. So let me just answer your questions that I've got here. Thank you so much. I'm a group 1. Group 2 have the slides. Yes, it probably is the other way around. I will fix it for you. Don't stress. They will be there, as will the recording. Guys, I know these recordings, the links don't last, which is why I've started a YouTube channel. So the links I put will be to the YouTube channel. If anybody struggles to access that, it's a new thing for me. I had to change the setting from public to private or private to public, but I think I figured it all out and I think it's working. So the links will go onto the YouTube channel. Sorry, I know, just one question. If it's okay, do you mind to message? You can message me wherever you want. You can message me on VC Learn or you can message me on emails. I check both, so it really doesn't matter. I tend to be quicker on my email because I generally have my emails open during the day, but please, either or, it really doesn't matter. Marking of ICE tasks, do we have to get 5 out of 5 to get the 2.5%? Yeah, so your ICE tasks count 10%. So in order to get the full 10%, basically you need to get 5 out of 5 for each of those questions. It's negligible. I mean, marking down to 4 out of 5, it's really just, it's not a big thing, but it's sufficient for me to say it's not 100% perfect. So if I mark you below 5, it means there's something with it that makes me feel that it's not quite perfect, and I'll give you feedback. But the ICE tasks together will accumulate 10%, but it's negligible. Yeah, guys, this might seem a little bit overwhelming, but please just go through it piece by piece by piece, like I've shown you in the slides. The slides are a summary of your textbook. I've added an extra information here and there, but basically it's giving you a summary of the textbook. So they're there as a start for you guys to build on it. There's some really great videos. Again, if you're stuck on anything, just Google. There's some really phenomenal videos. Things like your crash course are really good. So areas you don't understand, just Google, but please, you're welcome to ask me questions. So I think that's it. I've covered everything I wanted to cover. I will give you a little separate collab for this last section because I think it's so important. Guys, please stay warm, stay safe, stay dry. And we will see you at the COLA at the National Support Session on the 22nd. But before that, please feel free to be in contact if you need anything. So I'm going to stop the recording now.